At first light, Arlington breathed in mist and held it like a prayer, and Staff Sergeant Joe Park moved across the black mat with his boots clicking in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat, rifle steady against a chest that never seemed to rise, face carved from stone, the tomb behind him gleaming white as oath marble under a thin November sun. The hush around the plaza carried a weight that belonged to no single person, and every family at once. Cold air slid over the amphitheater steps, and through rows of white headstones that reached into the rolling distance like aligned sentinels, each one a name, a rank, a date, and all of them gathered in the silence Joe protected with each measured pass. Even the wind seemed to move carefully there, touching flags and bare branches without breaking the stillness. The crowd watched from the rope line in the posture of people who had entered a cathedral without a roof. An elderly Marine stood near the front in a campaign cap, faded by years and weather, his left hand resting on a cane, his right hand held flat against the handle as if at attention. A mother in a wool coat steadied a young girl in a wheelchair. A gold star pin shone from the mother's lapel, and the child's gloved fingers gripped a folded pamphlet with an intensity adults recognized and did not interrupt. Two high school boys who had arrived laughing 10 minutes earlier now held their phones at their sides, screens dark, shoulders squared as though the ritual had reached into them and found a better stance. A nurse in navy scrubs beneath her winter jacket clutched a funeral program at her chest, chin tucked, eyes fixed on Joe's turnpoint, with the concentration of someone listening for a heartbeat. Joe moved again. 21. Pause. Turn. Up close, his uniform looked less like clothing and more like discipline made visible. Every crease was sharp enough to cut glass. Brass buttons caught the pale light and returned it in restrained flashes. White gloves sat precise over hands that had carried more weight than most men ever named aloud. His kepi hat was angled to regulation exactness. The black leather of his shoes held a mirror shine that reflected marble and sky. The M14 rested in ceremonial control, not one loose motion, not one unnecessary adjustment. To the visitors, he could have been sculpted there by history itself. Inside, beneath that stillness, his awareness mapped every face, every shift in posture, every sound layered under the silence. He heard the cane tip-tap once on stone. He heard the faint mechanical whir of the wheelchair footrest moving half an inch. He heard a child in the second row whisper a question, and a father answer with one word, soft and immediate. He tracked a tour guide's inhale as she decided not to speak over the cadence. He counted breaths, distances, angles out of habit forged where hesitation had once cost lives. At Arlington, that vigilance served a different mission, but it was the same muscle. Guard what cannot defend itself. The tomb stood behind him with its carved inscription facing the world in solemn certainty. And Joe felt what he always felt there, a pressure behind the sternum that never weakened with repetition. Time did not pass in that place the way it passed elsewhere. Time layered. It settled. A school field trip from this morning stood beside a widow from last year, beside a medal ceremony from decades ago, beside names that never came home at all. Here, memory was not abstract. It had stone, shadow, and protocol. He reached the end of the mat. He pivoted with the exactness of a hinge. In the third row, the old Marine shifted his weight and touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap when Joe passed. The gesture was tiny and almost private, but Joe saw it in the outer margin of his vision. He did not break cadence. He did not alter expression. Still, inside the armored discipline of him, recognition answered recognition. Men who had stood watches understood one another without speech. Farther back, the girl in the wheelchair copied Joe's pause, freezing her small shoulders in imitation, then making her own careful turn. Her mother noticed and pressed her lips together to hold steady. When the child's wheel rolled too fast and bumped the curb, the nurse in scrubs crouched, adjusted the caster gently, and nodded once as if they were all on the same team in a task larger than any one body. By the second week of November, Joe had marched through rain, bright afternoons, and wind that cut across the plaza, hard enough to sting exposed skin. But the dawn watches carried a distinct gravity. Morning light made the marble look almost luminous. It also made people tell the truth with their posture. At noon, visitors sometimes came for photos, for itinerary, for momentum. At first light, they came for reasons they usually did not say aloud. A son brought his father, a teacher brought students, and watched them discover silence. A widow brought a letter she had never mailed. Joe did not know their full stories, yet he felt the contour of them each time the plaza quieted around his steps. He had been 31 for 3 months, 6'2", shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway without trying, jawline cut by a pale scar that ran from below his right ear toward his chin. From a distance, the scar disappeared into winter light. Up close, it reminded anyone who noticed that ceremony and combat were not opposite worlds. They were two faces of one oath. Papers in a personnel file could list his Bronze Star and deployments in Afghanistan and Syria. And those lines would be true, but those lines would still miss the architecture of the man. That architecture had been built by instructors, by squad leaders, by losses, by men who corrected his posture when he was 17 and furious at everything that moved. One of those men had been Sergeant First Class Harold Bennett, retired infantryman, JROTC teacher, voice rough from decades of command and morning coffee. Joe remembered a classroom with old campaign maps pinned to cinder-block walls, remembered Bennett standing in front of a folding table and showing teenagers how to fold a flag so no red or white showed at the end, only blue and stars, clean and final. Bennett had walked between desks, tapping knuckles lightly when shoulders slouched. Not cruel, never loud for effect, simply uncompromising in the way gravity is uncompromising. Discipline is love that knows where to stand, he had told Joe after class one gray afternoon, when the kid in front of him was all anger and no direction. Joe had carried that sentence like a compass ever since. The crowd at the tomb could not see those memories, but they could feel their result in the precision before them. What they saw was a sentinel. What they could not see was the full chain of hands that had shaped him. Instructors, teammates, medics, sergeants, friends who did not get to grow old. Joe's face remained unreadable, yet his duty was never empty form. Every pass across the mat answered someone. Every pause acknowledged someone. Every turn restored a line between the living and the fallen that the country needed held. A tour bus exhaled air at the curb far below the hill. Doors opened, and another stream of visitors began the climb. Their noise thinned as they approached the plaza, voices naturally dropping when they entered the perimeter of that ritual motion. A father carried a toddler on one shoulder. The child pointed at the rifle, and then at the marble, eyes wide but did not shout. 2 college students removed their hats and tucked them under their arms. A middle-aged man in a mechanic's jacket stood with oil-darkened hands clasped in front of him, gaze locked on Joe's pacing path, as if he were watching a truth he had needed all week. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. The line sounded almost out of place against the stone and mist, Yet it carried the same invitation the plaza itself carried. Witness this, and remember you belong to it. The old Marine glanced sideways at a young visitor and gave a faint nod, as though passing down permission to care this much in public. The nurse in scrubs unfolded her program and then folded it again with deliberate hands. The girl in the wheelchair straightened her back and lifted her chin to match the sentinel's bearing, tiny jaw set in fierce concentration. Joe reached the south end marker. He paused. He turned. A crow crossed the sky above the amphitheater, one black stroke against silver cloud, and even that felt measured in the morning's cadence. The frost at the edges of the grass caught light and gave it back in thin, clean lines. Beyond the tomb, the nation's capital lay under the same dawn, full of meetings, traffic, ambition, and noise, but up here on the hill, those forces did not lead. Here, order began with remembrance, and remembrance was guarded by men who accepted that anonymity might be the highest honor they would ever wear. He moved again, each step exact, each heel strike a quiet report on polished stone. The crowd followed him with their eyes, then with their breathing, then with their own posture, as shoulders lifted, backs straightened, conversations fell away. Reverence spread through them not as performance, but as contagion. The plaza became a held breath shared by strangers. Somewhere miles away, engines turned, schedules tightened, and people with authority badges made decisions that would collide with this morning before the day was done. Joe did not know the details yet. He did not need them. He stood his post in full fidelity to the mission in front of him, prepared in the old way for whatever crossed his line next. At Arlington, that was always the point. You guarded first. You learned names as they arrived. You carried what needed carrying. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. And on Joe's next pass, a runner from the relief detail came up the lower stair in controlled haste, boots quiet, face set, waiting at the edge of protocol until Joe reached his end marker. The signal was subtle. 2 fingers at the seam and a fractional nod, the kind of movement civilians missed and soldiers read like print. Joe completed the turn, completed the return, and held his stillness while the relief sentinel moved into position. The changeover happened with mechanical grace, ritual unbroken, and only then did the runner lean in and speak at a volume meant for one man. Staff Sergeant Park, Emergency Dignity Escort, Reagan National. Wheels up in 5, Joe answered with one word. Copy. The mist at Arlington still clung to his sleeves when he stepped into the transport SUV, and the hill of white stone fell behind him as the vehicle cut down toward the river, through waking traffic, toward an airport already loud with departure boards, rolling luggage, and the sharp weather of deadlines. By 7:18, the sun had cleared the low cloud, but the cold stayed hard enough to bite exposed skin. Joe sat forward in silence, uniform immaculate, white gloves still on, kepi exact, eyes tracking intersections, shoulders steady against each turn. The driver, a specialist from command transport, kept glancing at him like men glanced at monuments, quickly, respectfully, unsure whether to speak. At Reagan National, the curbside access road at Terminal B had been carved into rigid lanes by orange barricades and steel stanchions. Airport police stood at 2 points. Operations staff, in reflective vests, moved clipboards and radios in synchronized loops. An inbound diplomatic convoy had turned the whole frontage into a choreography of permissions and denials, and in the middle of that controlled movement, a white veteran medical van sat idling in the wrong lane for too long, hazard lights blinking in urgent amber pulses that looked like a heartbeat, trying not to fail. The van's side panel read, Veteran Care Transfer in block blue letters. Its back windows were shaded, but not enough to hide the shape of a gurney or the oxygen line rising and falling with each shallow breath. A monitor inside gave off a thin, repetitive chirp. Beside the rear door, a medic in a navy jacket held up transfer papers with one hand and pointed toward Joe with the other, trying to explain, trying to keep it procedural. The medic's voice carried above the traffic wash for a second, then vanished under a harder voice that snapped down the lane like a whip crack. Nolan Pike stood in front of the barricade with a tablet in one hand and a radio in the other, tailored overcoat open just enough to show cufflinks that flashed every time he cut his wrist through the air. He had the smooth posture of a man who had never once had to repeat an order, and the polished impatience of someone who measured human beings by throughput charts. Negative, he said. No escort code, no movement. You wait until the VIP lane clears. The medic took one step forward. Sir, this patient is terminal and time-bound for Arlington Overlook access. Pike did not look at the medic. He looked at Joe, at the white gloves and ceremonial bearing, and made the fatal assessment in under a second. You, he called, chin lifting in contempt he had refined over years of terminal command. Step aside, parade boy. You're delaying priority traffic. The words hit the curb, and the whole frontage went still in a way only moral violation can create. A veteran in a wheelchair near the automatic doors stopped mid-roll, knuckles whitening on the push rims. A class of middle school students in matching civics, trip hoodies froze around their teacher, bright paper badges hanging motionless on lanyards. A woman in business attire lowered her phone from her ear and stared. A baggage handler with grease on his palms halted with 2 suitcases tilted on a cart and did not move them again. Even the officer at the far barricade turned his head slowly, as if a distant bell had rung where no bell should ring. Pike kept talking, louder now because silence felt like resistance. I've got federal arrivals in 12 minutes, and this curb has one function. Ceremonial personnel do not dictate operations. Joe did not answer. To the crowd, he looked carved from granite, but inside every instinct was on high alert, cataloging lane width, med team spacing, oxygen supply position, barrier latch type, and the cadence of the patient monitor under the wash of jet noise. What Pike could not see, what no one there could have guessed from one glance at a gurney and a name tape, was that the frail man behind that glass was Sergeant First Class Harold Bennett, retired infantryman, JROTC instructor. The first man who had ever taught Joe Park that discipline was not hardness, but love with spine. A second chirp from inside the van came shorter than the first, then another. The students near door 4 began whispering in a chain reaction that moved faster than any announcement system. Is that military? One asked. Why won't they let him through? Another said, voice cracking between confusion and anger. Their teacher, a woman with wind-reddened cheeks and a stack of permission slips, clipped under her arm, pulled them tight into a half circle and said, Quiet now, though her own eyes never left the van. Near the crosswalk, an elderly man in a Korean war cap lifted his palm to his mouth and whispered, Not like this, to no one in particular. The pause sat there for a breath, deliberate and heavy, the way a drum line holds one beat longer before the turn, and then the scene widened instead of rushing forward, because some moments demanded witness before action. Reagan National smelled of jet fuel, coffee, wet concrete, and winter wool. Taxi lights swept yellow bands across the glass. Boarding calls echoed over the curbside speakers in clipped syllables that sounded absurdly ordinary, next to the thin alarm still ticking from the medical van. The airport was the profane world at full speed. Metrics, badges, schedules, reputations, and in the center of it stood a man from the sacred, who had spent his adult life protecting names carved in stone. Joe's uniform held the same exactitude it held at Arlington an hour earlier. Every crease stayed sharp enough to cut glass despite the drive. His brass caught the terminal lights in restrained points. White gloves remained pristine, though one thumb had shifted half a centimeter where he had flexed his hand once and only once. The kepi hat sat at regulation angle, shadowing eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. He was 31, 6'2", built like a wall that had learned to move quietly, and the pale scar below his right jaw showed clear in the airport fluorescence, a straight reminder that ceremony and war were bound by the same oath. Inside him, memory and present fused without sentimentality. Bennett at a classroom table, folding a flag with patient precision, saying, "Again," when corners missed by an inch. Bennett at a football field after school, catching Joe by the sleeve as the teenager tried to storm off, voice calm and immovable. Anger gives you heat, Park. Discipline gives you direction. Bennett in old boots at Veterans Day assembly, refusing applause, pointing instead to the empty chair set on stage for the missing. Those fragments were not nostalgia. They were architecture. They were why Joe's stillness now was not passivity, but force in reserve. Across from him, Nolan Pike radiated a different architecture entirely. Authority divorced from service, confidence built on access, not sacrifice. His operation badge hung on a lanyard stamped with federal seals. 2 assistant supervisors hovered behind him, one tapping updates into a tablet, the other watching gate cameras on a split-screen feed. Pike made a slicing gesture at the medic. "Reroute to Holding Bay C. I'll authorize movement after the dignitary convoy clears." He turned to Joe with a smirk that carried its own accusation. "You can play statue at your monument, not on my curb." Joe's gaze moved once from Pike to the van window, then to the med team lead. The lead gave a tiny nod and lifted the chart so Joe could read the top line where it mattered. Bennett, Harold J., SFC, retired, dignity transfer, Arlington final request. Below it, in the margin, a handwritten note from hospice staff. Patient lucid intermittently, wishes to see tomb overlook, family consent on file, time-sensitive respiratory decline. 3 days earlier, that note had been entered by a nurse who had not known it would become a battlefield document. Now it hung in cold air between policy and principle. The crowd at Terminal B thickened without anyone announcing it. Travelers drifted closer and then stopped when they sensed stakes they didn't yet understand. A father lifted his son so the child could see over shoulders. The boy's mittened hand rested against his dad's cheek, quiet, eyes fixed on Joe. The veteran in the wheelchair rolled forward until his footrests touched the painted line and then braked, chin up. 2 airport officers exchanged a glance that said they knew rules, and also knew rules were about to be tested by something older than a procedure. Pike raised his radio. "Ops control. Confirm lane lock. No unscheduled movement." Static answered. Then, "Confirmed." Joe finally spoke, voice low, formal, and carrying farther than volume should allow. "Director Pike, that patient is a retired Sergeant First Class on a final honors transfer. Delay is not neutral." Pike laughed once, sharp. "Delay is logistics. Don't make this dramatic." The monitor inside the van chirped again, faster now, an electronic metronome, counting down what pride could not purchase back. One medic opened the rear door 2 inches for airflow and looked toward Joe with eyes that had moved from professional calm to urgent appeal. Through the gap, Bennett's face came into view, skin paper-thin, oxygen mask clouding with each breath, Silver hair flattened at the temple, right hand resting on a wool blanket stitched with unit patches. The hand trembled once when the cold hit it. Joe saw the hand and recognized the knuckle ridge from decades-old drill corrections, that same firm tap against adolescent shoulders when posture slipped. His chest tightened with a force that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with vow. By 7:24, the diplomatic escort sirens were still 2 minutes out, and the lane remained blocked by order, by ego, by one man's inability to distinguish ceremonial discipline from ornamental labor. The students had gone silent now, fully silent, as if they sensed they were standing in a civics lesson no worksheet had prepared them for. The elderly veteran in the chair removed his cap and held it over his heart. The business traveler, who had lowered her phone minutes earlier, reached into her purse for tissues and did not look away. Joe took one measured breath, then another. His hands shifted at his sides, subtle, deliberate. Not yet action, but no longer rest. He looked at the barricade latch. He looked at Bennett. He looked at the route beyond the lane toward the military shuttle stand, where a driver in army greens had just stepped out, scanning, waiting. What happened next would not be about winning an argument at an airport curb. It would be about whether a nation's promises survived contact with convenience. Joe squared his shoulders to the lane, and the crowd leaned forward as one. Joe squared his shoulders to the lane, and the crowd leaned forward as one, held between a barricade and a vow. The cold came off the Potomac in thin blades that slipped under coat collars and down sleeves, carrying jet fuel, de-icing fluid, and roasted coffee from the kiosk behind door 3. Taxi headlights drew moving bars across wet concrete. Departure chimes rang through terminal speakers with sterile cheer, each tone colliding with the soft pulse alarm from Bennett's monitor. A gull wheeled above the parking structure, cried once and vanished into glare. Nothing in the scene was quiet, yet every witness seemed to hear only that narrow electronic chirp and the silence of the man in white gloves refusing to move aside. The airport frontage had become a map of America in miniature. The Korean War veteran in the wheelchair kept his cap over his heart, shoulders rigid despite the tremor in his wrists. Beside him, a woman in a navy blazer with a security badge clipped to her lapel had forgotten the call still open on her phone. She listened without blinking, lips parted, as if she were waiting for a command she could trust. The class from Loudoun County stood in a compressed half-circle near a pillar wrapped in holiday lights not yet lit, their matching hoodies bright against the gray morning, badges swinging as they shifted weight, heel to toe. One boy with freckles had tears standing in his eyes and looked furious about them. Their teacher kept one arm extended across the front row, shepherding by instinct, though her gaze stayed fixed on the van. A baggage handler in reflective tape let his cart roll to a stop and brace both palms on the handle, knuckles pale under machine grease. A young father held his son at chest height, the child's boots dangling, tiny fingers hooked into the collar of a peacoat. Near the curb cut, a nurse from another transfer company, still wearing disposable gloves she had forgotten to remove, stared at Bennett through the open crack of the rear doors with a professional's grim recognition of breathing patterns that did not recover. 2 airport police officers remained at their posts, boots planted shoulder-width apart, hands near belts but not on them, both men measuring what authority required and what honor demanded. At the center of that suspended moment stood Staff Sergeant Joe Park, and his bearing looked like a line drawn in ink no weather could lift. His overcoat sat perfectly aligned across broad shoulders, epaulets flat, seams true. The dark wool carried a faint sheen under terminal lights, immaculate despite mist and road grit. The brass on his uniform flashed in clean points each time a rotating beacon passed over him. His tie was centered to the fraction. His collar insignia sat level, not a degree off. White gloves, still fastened at the wrist, rested against his trouser seams with disciplined stillness, though the tendons beneath them had tightened into cable. The kepi's leather visor cast a hard shadow over eyes that scanned constantly. Latch, lane width, medics, police, shuttle stand, Pike's right hand, Bennett's oxygen line. His shoes held a mirror shine that reflected orange barricade paint and the red blink of hazard lights, bright evidence that ritual precision had traveled with him from sacred marble to wet airport concrete. The old scar below his right jaw caught the light when he turned his head, pale and straight as chalk on slate. It had healed years ago and never softened. On paper, it was listed with a date and wound code. In his body, it was a permanent annotation. Memory had edges. To the travelers lining the curb, Joe looked ceremonial, deliberate, maybe even distant. To those who understood soldiering, the posture read differently. Every muscle was set without appearing tense. His stance gave no opening for panic, no invitation for escalation, no surrender to the chaos of schedules and badges. He stood as though he had planted his boots on an older ground than this one. Nolan Pike mistook that composure for hesitation. He stepped half a pace forward, cufflinks flashing again, radio lifted near his mouth. "Last warning," he said, voice sharpened for an audience. "Move off this lane. You are not in command here." The word struck hard and fell flat. Joe did not grant him a glance. His focus stayed on the van, where Bennett's chest rose shallowly under a blanket, stitched with regiment patches, and then paused too long before the next breath arrived. The med team lead, Lieutenant Carla Ruiz, held the chartboard against her body to stop her hands from shaking. She had worked oncology wards, trauma bays, medevac corridors, and she knew the narrow margin between a meaningful final request and one more institutional apology. She leaned toward Joe and spoke without lifting her voice. "He's lucid in short windows. We're losing those windows." Her eyes flicked to the monitor and back. "If we stall, he won't know where he is when we get there." Joe gave a single nod so slight many in the crowd missed it. The nod was agreement, gratitude, and decision all at once. Then his gaze settled on Bennett's right hand, resting above the blanket, and the present cracked open into memory so cleanly it felt like another lane beside this one. He was 17 again, in a cinder-block classroom that smelled of floor wax and marker ink, rain tapping the high windows while fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead. Harold Bennett stood at the front with a folded flag on the table, forearms rope thick under a faded PT shirt, voice rough as boot leather. "Triangles matter," he said, guiding a corner inward. "Not because cloth cares, because families do." Teenagers shifted in metal chairs, half listening, half posturing for each other, and Bennett caught every drift of attention, like a drill instructor, with a schoolteacher's patience. Joe had come in angry that day, jaw tight, knuckles marked from a hallway scuffle, ready to challenge any rule put in front of him. Bennett had handed him the flag instead of a reprimand. "You fold this with respect, or you fold it again." By late October that year, Joe had stayed after class 3 afternoons in a row, not because he wanted extra drill, but because Bennett had given his anger a job. Feet together, chin level. Breathe through your nose. Speak when spoken to. Listen all the way through. The rules were ordinary. Their effect was not. One evening, as the last bus pulled away and the parking lot went dark except for a sodium lamp buzzing over cracked asphalt, Joe muttered that discipline felt like a cage. Bennett rested both palms on the desk, looked him dead on, and delivered the sentence that would anchor the rest of Joe's life. Discipline is love that knows where to stand. That line traveled with him to basic, to airborne school, to his first deployment in eastern Afghanistan, where mountains turned distances into lies and radio static carried more dread than noise. He met specialist Nate Hollis on day 4 at the outpost near Gardez, where dust lived in every seam and sleep came in thin strips. Hollis was the radio man, quick with frequencies, quicker with humor, a narrow-shouldered kid from Oklahoma with a grin that could pull a whole squad back from the edge after a 12-hour patrol. During the first chow line mix-up, Hollis tripped on a tent tie-down, sent a tray skidding, and saluted the mess sergeant with mock ceremony. "If I trip carrying chow again," he said, deadpan while everyone laughed, "tell command it was tactical gravity." Even the platoon sergeant cracked a smile. In Joe's first winter overseas, they ran convoy security on roads that changed allegiance block by block. Hollis sat beside him in the MATV, headset crooked, humming old country songs under his breath when the route went too quiet. Joe learned the rhythm of that voice the way he learned terrain, where it steadied, where it thinned, where it signaled trouble before instruments did. In Coast Province, during a market sweep that turned tense in seconds, Hollis caught a drop transmission no one else heard, shifted them 50 meters off the planned line, and likely saved 3 lives without fanfare. When Joe thanked him later, Hollis shrugged and said, "I just listened harder than my panic." The second Afghanistan tour carved deeper. Heat came early, then storms of grit that erased horizon and left men tasting metal for hours. The squad had rotated to Route Red, a supply corridor with too many roadside graves and not enough maps worth trusting. On a morning that began like any other, convoy spacing correct, checks complete, Hollis leaned over from the comms seat and tapped Joe's sleeve. "When we get home," he said, "I'm buying a stake bigger than this truck and naming it Sergeant." Joe smirked despite himself. "You name your stake after rank, I'm writing you up." Hollis grinned. "Worth it." The blast took the laughter first. Sound folded inward, then struck back. The vehicle shuddered, alarms screamed, dust and smoke filled the cab in one violent surge. Joe felt heat at his jaw and a wet line down his neck, tasted copper, heard someone shouting his name from far away and near at once. Training took over where thought couldn't. Secure perimeter. Check casualties. Return report. He reached for Hollis and found stillness where motion should have been. Medics moved fast, did everything right, and still the day ended with a folded flag and a silence Joe would carry like extra gear for the rest of his life. The scar under his right jaw came from shrapnel in that blast. Surgeons closed it in Bagram. Time closed the skin. Nothing closed the absence. When he finally stood in formation again stateside, Bronze Star paperwork pending, men around him talking about leave and weddings and truck payments, Joe heard only the missing counterpoint of Hollis humming under his breath. Grief could have turned him inward, bitter, unmoored. Bennett refused that outcome with 2 phone calls and 1 visit. The first call came at 0530, Bennett's old instructor tone unchanged. "You eatin'?" he asked. Joe lied and said yes. Bennett knew better and said, "Fix that." The second call was shorter. "You coming home this weekend?" It wasn't a question. Joe drove down Saturday in silence and found Bennett in the high school gym, setting up folding chairs for a veterans panel nobody expected teenagers to attend. Bennett handed him one end of a table and, after 10 minutes of work, said, "Loss doesn't excuse you from duty. It defines where your duty points next." Later, in the empty hallway lined with team photos and faded banners, he added, You don't honor the dead by collapsing. You honor them by standing watch where memory needs guards. Joe carried that instruction into a third tour in Syria, where the landscape shifted from urban concrete to open dust within miles and alliances changed faster than maps. He was steadier then, harder in some ways, softer in the right ones. He learned to read crowds, to spot the one face scanning exits, to hear the click in a voice that meant a hidden trigger, to move his team without telegraphing fear. He came home with more commendations and less appetite for applause. When assignment options opened, he requested the old guard without hesitation. Some peers were surprised. They saw ceremony as a capstone, a polished finish. Joe saw a front line of another kind. At Arlington, he discovered Bennett had been right in ways even Bennett might not have measured. The tomb was not pageantry. It was a living contract. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat became a language of national memory spoken without words. Every crease, every polished surface, every regulation angle was not vanity, but respect made visible for strangers who arrived carrying private griefs they had never learned to name. Joe learned to march for names he would never know, for families who still set one extra plate at holidays, for young recruits trying to understand why service mattered, and for one radio man who used humor like a shield and deserved to be remembered by men who kept their footing. 2 weeks before this morning, Bennett had called from hospice with breath already thin, but voice intact. "Park," he said, and Joe could hear the smile behind the oxygen hiss. "You still walking that marble like it owes you money?" Joe answered, "Yes, Sergeant." Bennett coughed, recovered, and said, "Good. I want one more look at that place. Not the photos. The real rail, real stone." Joe promised, formal and immediate. "You have my word." Now that word stood at Terminal B behind a barricade controlled by a man who measured value in lane clearance times. Joe's memory closed and the present snapped back into full clarity. Wet concrete, blinking hazards, Pike's radio crackle, Ruiz gripping the chart, Bennett's pulse ox chirping faster than before. The crowd remained frozen, but it was no longer passive. Faces had changed. Strangers who arrived thinking about flights now understood they were watching a test of what the country did when honor collided with convenience. Joe lowered his chin a fraction, the way he had before stepping onto patrol routes, where one decision shaped every consequence after it. His right hand lifted to the cuff of his left glove and paused there. Precise, deliberate, as if the entire terminal had narrowed to that single point of motion. His right hand lifted to the cuff of his left glove and paused there. Precise, deliberate, as if the entire terminal had narrowed to that single point of motion, and Nolan Pike mistook even that pause for compliance. Pike had built his career on that mistake. He came out of private logistics contracting with a reputation for shaving minutes off turnarounds and turning airports into performance charts, and he wore that reputation the way some men wore medals, polished, public, and constantly displayed. 2 years earlier, a state transportation board had elevated him into airport operations with language about modernization and efficiency, and he had learned quickly that numbers could protect arrogance if the right people benefited from the trend line. His office wall, 3 floors above the curb, held framed commendations from business councils, a glossy photo with a governor, and a dashboard screen that never slept. Arrivals, departures, curb occupancy, VIP throughput, average delay. On that screen, no one had a name. They had a category. They were either flow or obstruction. Now he stood at the barricade as if the lane belonged to him by moral right. Jaw set, scarf folded, with the same meticulous vanity, Joe gave his uniform for opposite reasons. Pike's overcoat hung open to reveal a tailored suit, cut too fine for November wind, his cufflinks bright as signal mirrors each time he flicked his wrist. He had one assistant at his left shoulder, reading live updates from a tablet, and another behind him relaying lane status to command, and both moved in his wake with the practiced tension of staff accustomed to public correction. "Ops Control," Pike said into his radio, voice clipped. "Confirm dignitary convoy ETA. 90 seconds. He nodded once, then lifted his chin toward Lieutenant Ruiz in the van. "You heard that? Hold this unit in place. No exceptions." Ruiz took one careful step forward, chart pressed to her chest. "Director Pike, hospice clearance and Arlington Command authorization are on file. He has a final visit request." Pike's expression did not shift. "He has a request. I have a federal traffic protocol. He is not cargo. He is unscheduled." The words landed like metal on stone. The class from Loudoun County didn't whisper now. They watched in hard silence, absorbing every syllable. A teenage girl in the second row tightened her grip on a notebook until the spiral bent. The Korean War veteran in the wheelchair lowered his cap from his chest to his lap, then straightened his spine and held Pike's gaze with the calm fury of a man who had buried friends before Pike learned to drive. Near door 3, the father holding his son adjusted the boy higher on his hip. The child leaned forward, knitted cap slipping over one eye, and asked in a small voice, "Why won't they help him?" The father didn't answer. He couldn't. Pike cut his gaze toward Joe again, dismissive and theatrical. "And you," he said, "your ceremonial staff, you do ceremonies. Do not interfere in live airport operations." He jabbed one finger toward the white gloves as if they were proof of irrelevance. "You stand still for tourists. That's your lane." What no one around him missed was that he had not once spoken Bennett's name. In Pike's framework, this was simple. A medical van lacked his preferred escort code. A dignitary convoy was inbound. A lane had to be cleared. A man in dress uniform looked ornamental. The equation solved itself. He did not know Joe's deployments. He did not know the scar under Joe's jaw came from root red. He did not know the stillness in front of him had been forged under mortar fire and carried into sacred duty by choice. Most of all, he did not know the patient in the van had once taught that same sentinel how to stand a post when standing hurt. Pike made his contempt explicit for the crowd now, as if volume could turn judgment into fact. "This is exactly the problem," he said to no one and everyone. "Every time there's a uniform, people get sentimental and forget systems. We are not shutting down a federal terminal for just another old man in a uniform story." A hiss moved through the witnesses, low and unified, not loud but unmistakable. One traveler muttered, "Did he just say that?" Another answered, "He did." The baggage handler by the cart looked away, jaw flexing, then looked back with the expression of someone struggling to keep his hands at his sides. An airport police sergeant at the near post shifted his weight and keyed his shoulder mic without speaking, eyes fixed on Pike, then on Joe, then on the van. Inside the van, Bennett's monitor chirped 3 times in tight succession. Ruiz turned, checked the reading, and her voice thinned despite training. "Pulse ox 82 and falling." Joe still had not moved. Externally, he remained regulation, made flesh, shoulders square, chin level, boots planted on wet concrete as firmly as on black mat. Internally, the field of his awareness widened and sharpened. Pike's stance favored his right side. The barricade latch sat 30 inches from Joe's left boot. The military shuttle driver at the far stand had moved closer, ready but awaiting a signal. Ruiz's team could roll the gurney in 5 seconds, if the path opened clean. The nearest police officer would intervene only if contact escalated. The convoy sirens were louder now, threading through terminal noise from the inbound road. Joe let the data settle, then spoke with a calm that carried farther than Pike's raised voice. Director Pike, identify your legal basis for denying a time-critical veteran dignity transfer with command authorization. Pike laughed again, brittle. My legal basis is this badge and this lane. Joe's eyes did not leave him. Name the statute. Don't play lawyer with me, parade boy. The title snapped through the cold like a slap. The crowd reacted in fragments. Unreal, someone whispered. He called him that again, said another. The teacher at the edge of the student group closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them, and stood taller as if bracing to witness the rest without flinching. Pike stepped closer, invading distance he did not understand. Move back behind that stanchion. Final instruction. He reached for Joe's upper sleeve with 2 fingers, not a shove, not yet force, but the gesture of a man who believed touch could assert hierarchy when words failed. He never made contact. Joe shifted 1/2 inch, a minimal adjustment that removed the target and preserved distance without aggression. Pike's hand cut empty air. The near miss told the crowd what they needed to know. Joe had allowed no escalation. Pike had attempted one. By the 3rd minute at the barricade, the terminal frontage had transformed from travel corridor to witness chamber. More people stopped at the edges and stayed. A woman in a flight attendant uniform set her roller bag upright and folded her hands over the handle. 2 mechanics in orange vests came out from a service door and stood shoulder to shoulder by the curb paint, silent. A chaplain in civilian clothes, collar tab visible at the throat, removed his gloves and tucked them into his pocket, eyes wet and unblinking. Ruiz held up the chart again so Pike could not pretend ignorance. Dignity transfer. Final request. Hospice signed. Family consent. Arlington command copied. We are out of time. Pike did not read it. He pointed toward holding Bay C. Then expire in holding. Not here. The sentence struck the air and seemed to drain warmth from it. Even the assistant with the tablet looked at Pike in startled disbelief before schooling his face flat. Joe heard several intakes of breath at once, the collective recoil of strangers hearing a line crossed in real time. Joe's right thumb pressed against the glove cuff once, then released. His heartbeat remained steady. His breathing remained controlled. Beneath the stillness, every muscle had gone live. Not for violence, for precision. He calculated lift angle from gurney height, oxygen tubing slack, Ruiz's strongest medic position, shortest path through the gap, distance to shuttle. He assessed Pike's reach and center of balance. He tracked the convoy sirens rising. He tracked Bennett's breaths falling apart. At 7:25, 40 yards away, a digital billboard above security rotated from a luxury watch ad to a public service slide about honoring veterans. The timing was accidental. The effect was not. Half the crowd saw it and then looked back at the lane, as if the airport itself had been forced to testify against its own director. Pike saw the gaze shift and harden further, mistaking moral pressure for a challenge to authority he needed to crush. He lifted his radio. Ops, dispatch additional officers to Terminal B curb. Potential non-compliance. Joe answered before the call finished, voice flat and formal. There is compliance with duty. Pike's stare narrowed. Your duty is to stand still. Joe's gaze cut once toward Bennett through the cracked doors. The old sergeant's eyes were half open now, unfocused, searching. His right hand moved weakly against the blanket, 2 fingers lifting and falling as if trying to shape a salute through fatigue and oxygen hiss. Joe felt the gesture like a command arriving across years. 3 rows back, the boy with freckles whispered to his teacher, Is he going to die before they let him go? She swallowed, then said, Not if the right person decides in time. She did not specify who that person was. She did not need to. Seconds stretched. Departure chimes rang again. Tires hissed on wet pavement. The convoy sirens were now close enough to rattle the metal signpost by the barricade. Pike straightened his coat and took one step to block the narrow opening between stanchions, physically placing himself as gatekeeper between Bennett and the route to Arlington. Joe did not blink. Inside him, instinct and instruction aligned with clean force. Preserve life, preserve dignity, preserve mission. Bennett's classroom voice and Hollis's grin and Arlington's marble all converged into a single operational truth. Delay was no longer procedural. Delay was harm. He turned his left wrist, released the glove clasp, and began to peel the white glove, free finger by finger, each movement unhurried, exact, and devastating in its clarity. The crowd understood before Pike did. A murmur rolled through the terminal frontage like distant thunder, then stopped on a breath as Joe removed the second glove and folded both into a perfect square. He handed the gloves to Ruiz without taking his eyes off Pike. "Lieutenant," he said, "on my mark, maintain airway and line control." Ruiz nodded once. "Ready?" Joe stepped to the van doors, measured the height of the gurney rail with one glance, and set his hands beneath Bennett's shoulders and knees with the care of a ceremonial bearer preparing a flag transfer. Pike moved to intercept, arm coming up, voice rising into command, and the entire terminal froze, waiting for the next word. Joe lifted, not with strain, with ceremony. His right forearm slid beneath Bennett's shoulders, left arm under his knees, hands set where weight would distribute, without jarring the oxygen line or tugging the blanket. Ruiz moved with him, one palm stabilizing the mask, the other guiding the monitor cable clear of the gurney rail. The motion looked almost slow, but it was built from thousands of drilled repetitions. Assess, secure, carry. Bennett's body rose from the mattress by inches, then settled into Joe's hold with the fragile heaviness of a man who had spent a lifetime carrying others and now had no strength left to carry himself. Pike lunged to block the gap, overcoat flaring, radio slapping his chest. "Put him down!" Joe turned his shoulders a fraction, enough to shield Bennett from contact without striking Pike, and kept moving. Pike reached again, hand open toward Joe's sleeve, and stopped cold when airport police finally stepped in, one officer extending an arm across Pike's path. "Director, stand back," Pike snapped. "That is an unauthorized removal." Joe's voice came level as steel, low and unmistakable, and it cut through the terminal noise like a command on a firing line. "He taught me what honor costs. He will see the tomb today." The sentence hung there, single and complete, and the terminal answered with a sharp collective inhale. A woman near door 3 covered her mouth. The boy in his father's arms straightened, eyes wide. The Korean War veteran in the wheelchair lifted his chin and whispered, "Carry on, Sergeant." With tears he did not wipe away. Students who had never stood a watch in their lives stood straighter without being told. Joe stepped through the stanchion opening as Ruiz and a second medic moved in formation at his flanks, one managing oxygen, one gathering monitor leads. Bennett's head rested against Joe's shoulder. His eyes fluttered, then opened halfway, searching, and Joe saw recognition spark through pain and medication haze. "Park?" Bennett breathed, barely audible. "Yes, Sergeant. I've got you." Pike shouted toward Ops Control, voice cracking at the edges now. "Lock this lane down. Stop that shuttle. Detain them." No one moved to obey him. The nearest officers held position between Pike and the transfer team. Not hostile, simply decisive. Ruiz's boots splashed through shallow rainwater as she kept pace. Bennett's pulse ox alarm still chirped, but less erratically now that the transfer was in motion and mask seal was stable. 20 yards away, the military shuttle driver snapped to readiness, rear doors already open. He had seen enough. He did not ask questions. He dropped the ramp and braced it with one foot. Joe reached the shuttle, pivoted with controlled precision, and lowered Bennett onto the padded transfer cot in one continuous, careful arc. Ruiz checked airway, line, and monitor in 3 practice touches. Mask secure. Sat trending up to 86. Bennett's fingers twitched against the blanket, then found Joe's wrist for 1 second, a weak grip carrying decades of instruction, correction, and faith. Joe leaned close enough for Bennett alone to hear. Route is clear, Sergeant. Behind them, the terminal erupted into layered sound again, but it was no longer routine airport noise. It was witness noise. Murmurs rippled in fast waves. Someone began clapping once, then stopped, unsure if applause belonged in a moment like this. A teacher pressed both hands to her student's shoulders and said, voice shaking, "Remember this, all of it." A baggage handler pulled off his cap and held it against his chest. The flight attendant with the roller bag stood at attention without realizing she had done it. Pike tried one last time to reclaim command, stepping toward the shuttle with his badge raised high. "I am ordering this vehicle to hold position." The shuttle driver looked past him to Joe, then to Ruiz, then back to Pike. "Sir, I'm under military transfer authority." "You are under airport authority in this curb." Joe closed the shuttle door halfway, paused, and met Pike's stare across the ramp. "Director, your authority ends where dignity begins." Pike's jaw locked. For the first time, he looked smaller than his title. By 7:26 a.m., sirens from the inbound convoy had merged with a second set coming hard from the service road. Black SUVs cutting through the access lane, with hazard strobes reflecting off wet glass. Doors opened before the lead vehicle fully stopped. Major General Ruth Ellison stepped out in service dress and overcoat, command staff behind her in a tight line, Arlington insignia bright under terminal lights. She did not hurry. She advanced with the controlled speed of someone who had already made her decision in the car. "Who is Director Pike?" Pike raised his hand at once, relief rushing into his posture, as if senior rank had arrived to validate him. "Major General, thank you. We have a non-compliant ceremonial soldier interfering with Federal Lane protocol." "I need immediate—" Ellison cut him off with one raised palm. "Silence, Director." The word landed like a gavel. Pike stopped. Ellison turned to Ruiz first. "Medical status." Ruiz answered without hesitation. "Terminal veteran, Sergeant First Class Harold Bennett, retired infantry. Final request dignity transfer to Tomb Overlook. Delay at barricade caused respiratory decline. Staff Sergeant Park executed manual transfer to preserve airway and timeline." Ellison nodded once and looked to Joe. He stood beside the shuttle door, gloves absent, uniform still immaculate except for a faint crease across one sleeve, where Bennett's weight had rested. "Staff Sergeant Park, did you use force?" "No, ma'am." "Did you deviate from ceremonial protocol?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Joe held her gaze. "To honor a dying soldier's final request under time-critical medical conditions." For half a heartbeat, the terminal went utterly still. Even Pike's assistant stopped typing. Ellison stepped forward until she stood between Pike and the shuttle, then faced the crowd as much as the principals, her voice carrying formal command to every corner of the curb. "Emergency Dignity Transport Authority is active and valid under Arlington Command. This transfer is lawful. This transfer is ordered. Staff Sergeant Park acted within duty, judgment, and honor." Gas broke across the witnesses, followed by a low swell of approval that stayed respectful but unmistakable. The Korean War veteran struck his cane once against the pavement in affirmation. One student whispered, "He was right," and another answered, "Yeah." Pike found his voice brittle and indignant. "General, with respect, I manage this terminal. He overrode my control in front of civilian traffic." Ellison turned on him with the calm ferocity of rank used correctly. "You obstructed veteran medical access after notification, dismissed a documented final honors transfer, and attempted to physically impede movement. Effective immediately, you are removed from operational command pending federal review." Pike blinked, as if he had misheard his own future. "Removed? On whose authority?" Ellison did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Mine, in coordination with Department Oversight and Airport Police Command, already notified en route. Surrender your operations badge and radio." One of Pike's assistants took an involuntary step backward. The airport police sergeant moved in, respectful but firm, hand extended. "Director, badge and radio, please." Pike looked around for support and found none. The officers held neutral faces. His assistants stared at the ground. The crowd watched in hard silence. For a moment he seemed ready to argue again, then his shoulders sagged by a visible inch. He unclipped the badge, pulled the radio from his belt, and placed both in the sergeant's hand. Ellison gave him one final sentence, public and precise. "You confuse throughput with duty. They are not the same." Pike said nothing. He was escorted toward the service corridor, not cuffed, not dragged, simply stripped of command in front of the people he had expected to command forever. Ellison pivoted back to Joe. Formality remained, but something warmer entered her expression. The professional recognition of one soldier seeing another hold the line under pressure. "Staff Sergeant Park, resume mission. Arlington route is cleared from this curb to Overlook. Escort package is yours." "Yes, ma'am." She glanced at his bare hands. "Where are your gloves?" Ruiz lifted them from the chart pouch where she had protected them during transfer, folded square exactly as Joe had handed them off. She placed them back in Joe's palm. Ellison saw the exchange and gave a brief nod, tiny but loaded with meaning. "Carry on?" The shuttle doors closed. Engine rose. 2 military escorts moved ahead, one behind. The lane opened without further dispute. Travelers stepped back to clear the path, many with heads bowed as the vehicle passed. The father lowered his son so the child could stand and watch properly. The boy raised a small hand in an uncertain salute. Joe, through the glass, answered with a brief incline of his head. As the convoy rolled out, the teacher from Loudown called softly to her class. "Phones down." They were already down. No one wanted a clip. They wanted memory. At the terminal, command staff dispersed into action. Incident logs initiated, camera footage secured, witness statements requested. The police sergeant tagged Pike's surrendered badge in an evidence envelope. Ops Control acknowledged new chain of command over radio with clipped, sober confirmations. Every external call made in the standoff now had an outcome, documented and moving. Inside the shuttle, Ruiz monitored Bennett's breathing while Joe sat at his side, one hand braced near the rail to steady against turns. Bennett's eyes opened once more, clearer this time, and tracked Joe's face. "You kept your word," he whispered. Joe's jaw tightened around emotion he would not display beyond this cabin. "Yes, Sergeant." Bennett's mouth moved in the ghost of a smile. "Discipline." He breathed each syllable thin but deliberate. "Is love. That knows where to stand." Joe bowed his head once, the gesture of a student receiving instruction, all over again. Outside, November light widened over the river, and the convoy drove toward Arlington, with authority restored, mission intact, and honor no longer delayed. The lead escort cut a clean lane through morning traffic, tires hissing over damp pavement, while the shuttle behind held steady speed as if sudden motion itself would be a form of disrespect. Joe sat braced beside Bennett, one hand near the cot rail, the other lightly securing the blanket so it would not slip when they took the bridge ramp. Ruiz tracked the monitor in practiced silence. Oxygen hissed in soft bursts. Bennett's breaths came shallow but less jagged than at the terminal, and each stable reading on the screen felt like borrowed time spent wisely. At 7:41 a.m., they passed the cemetery gates. Arlington rose ahead in layered green and white, hills and headstones and bare-limbed trees holding the thin gold of early sun. The shuttle climbed slowly toward the overlook route, pre-cleared by command. 2 military police vehicles stood off the lane, not intrusive, simply present to keep it open. The air looked colder up there than it had at the airport, crisp enough to sting lungs on the first inhale, clean enough to carry the faint scent of wet grass and polished stone. Joe felt the shift in Bennett even before the old sergeant spoke. His eyelids fluttered, then lifted. His gaze found the window and held there, fixed on rows of markers stepping away over the hills like a formation that never broke rank. "Home ground," Bennett whispered. "Yes, Sergeant," Joe said. "Home ground." At the designated overlook access point, a small receiving team waited. A hospice nurse with a gray scarf tucked into her coat, a chaplain from Arlington Support Services, and Colonel Matthew Hale from command staff with a folder under one arm and gloves folded in his hand. Hale's face had the calm wear of a man who had already been awake for hours. He opened the shuttle door himself. No cameras, no press, no speeches, just a corridor of respect built by people who understood what this minute cost. "Staff Sergeant Park," Hale said quietly. "Route and rail are secured. You have full access." Joe nodded once. Ruiz released cot brakes. Together they guided Bennett down the ramp and onto the paved approach that led to the marble rail overlooking the tomb axis. Wheels rolled softly over stone joints. The nurse adjusted the oxygen line to keep slack out of the turn. The chaplain walked one step behind, head lowered, giving presence without intrusion. A few visitors stood at a respectful distance, held back by rope and by instinct. Among them were the mother with the Gold Star pin and her daughter in the wheelchair from Dawn Watch, still wrapped in the same wool blanket, small hands in knit gloves, eyes wide and unwavering. Beside them stood the elderly Marine with the cane, posture straighter now despite fatigue in his shoulders. A little farther back, the Korean War veteran from the airport had arrived in a courtesy transport arranged by one of the officers who saw him at Terminal B. He sat in his chair with cap on, chin high, as if he had refused to let the story end anywhere but here. The Lowdown teacher was there as well, 10 students behind her, in a silent line, permission slips and schedules forgotten for the day by unanimous adult consent. She had called the school from the bus and said only, "They need to witness this." Joe did not look for applause. He looked for clearance and footing and Bennett's breathing rhythm. When they reached the rail, Ruiz locked the cot wheels. Joe removed his kepi, tucked it beneath his arm, and leaned in close. "Sergeant Bennett," he said, voice formal and gentle at once. "You're at the tomb overlook." Bennett's eyes sharpened for one clear window of lucidity. His hand trembled upward. Joe took it carefully, guided it to the cold marble rail. The old sergeant's fingers spread across the stone, feeling not texture alone but permanence, and his chest lifted on a breath that sounded like relief after a long climb. For several seconds he said nothing. Wind moved through the trees below. Somewhere down the slope, boots struck mat in measured cadence. 21 steps. Pause, turn, Repeat. The sound reached the overlook like a heartbeat carried through ground. Bennett turned his head slightly toward Joe. "Who do you march for?" he asked, each word thin but precise. Joe's jaw tightened. He did not hide from the question. "Specialist Nate Hollis," he said. "Radio man? Root red?" Bennett's eyes closed once, opened, and fixed on Joe with recognition, older than either uniform he wore now. His lips moved, barely audible. Nate Hollis. He repeated the name as if placing it where it belonged, into memory held by more than one man. Then his right hand struggled upward from the blanket. The motion was small, shaky, but unmistakable. Bennett raised a trembling salute toward the tomb. Joe answered instantly, full and exact. Around them nobody spoke. The mother with the gold star pin pressed one hand to her mouth. The daughter in the wheelchair lifted her own small hand and mirrored the salute with fierce concentration, elbow too high, fingers imperfect, spirit exact. The elderly Marine at the rope line came to attention, with the cane braced against his leg. The Korean War veteran removed his cap and held it at his heart. One of the Loudown students, the freckled boy who had asked the hardest question at the airport, stood with tears on his cheeks and did not wipe them away this time. Bennett's salute lowered. His hand drifted back to the blanket. Ruiz checked pulse and oxygen, then met Joe's eyes and gave a quiet nod that carried clinical truth without cruelty. The lucid window was closing. The chaplain stepped closer. "Would you like prayer, Sergeant Bennett?" Bennett's mouth moved. "No prayer now," he breathed. "Just keep watch." Joe leaned in until he was near enough for Bennett to hear without strain. "We will, Sergeant. We will keep watch." By 7:53 a.m., hospice transport was staged at the lower curb, and the transfer from overlook to ambulance happened, with the same care as every move before it. Ruiz and the hospice nurse coordinated lines and portable oxygen. Joe steadied the cot through the slope transition. Hands firm, movements economical. Bennett remained conscious long enough to feel the sun on his face once more as they turned away from the rail. He did not speak again, but his expression had changed. The tightness around his eyes had eased into something like completion. At the ambulance doors, Hale stepped in with the command folder and addressed Joe in a low, official cadence meant for record and for respect. "Staff Sergeant, incident outcomes for your awareness. Terminal camera footage is preserved and transferred to federal investigators. Witness statements are logged, including from airport police, medical team, and civilian observers. Director Pike's badge and radio were booked into evidence custody at 8:02. Interim Operations Command accepted by Deputy Director with written acknowledgement of dignity transfer protocol." Joe nodded. "Copy, sir." Hale held his gaze one beat longer. "You made the right call." The loaded look from Pike's tablet assistant at the curb found its answer there, too. He had submitted a written statement within the hour, corroborating Ruiz's timeline and Pike's direct language, then requested reassignment out of operations oversight. The second assistant had done the same. Neither tried to protect a broken chain of command once the facts were sworn. Their silence at the terminal had not been loyalty. It had been shock catching up to conscience. The hospice nurse climbed into the ambulance and checked Bennett's blanket one final time. Joe stepped to the threshold, careful not to crowd the narrow space. "Sergeant Bennett," he said. Bennett's eyes opened a fraction. "Mission complete," Joe told him. A faint smile touched the corners of Bennett's mouth. He squeezed Joe's wrist once, barely there, then released. The doors closed softly. No siren. The ambulance rolled down the lane at respectful speed toward hospice care, and Joe watched until it passed below the trees and out of sight. The crowd at the overlook remained in place for a long moment after the vehicle departed, as if the air itself required stillness to settle. Then the Korean War veteran set his cap back on his head and wheeled forward 2 feet, stopping beside Joe. "You carried him right," he said. Joe inclined his head. "Thank you, sir." The veteran glanced toward the 2 Maxes. "Don't let people like that airport man tell this country what matters." "They won't," Joe said. The Loudown teacher approached next with her students gathered behind her. She did not ask for photos. She simply said, "Staff Sergeant, they saw what duty looks like today?" Her voice steadied. "That lesson will outlast any textbook." Joe answered with formal simplicity. "Then they carry it now." The mother with the gold star pin guided her daughter closer to the rope line. The child lifted her hand again, repeating the salute she had practiced all morning. This time Joe, kepi back on, returned it with crisp precision, meant wholly for her. The girl's face lit with solemn pride, not childish excitement. And her mother closed her eyes for a second as if absorbing medicine. There were no more speeches to give. Hale moved off to complete paperwork and chain of custody signatures. Ruiz departed with her team, chart packets sealed and transferred to hospice intake, every medical document accounted for. Airport incident logs, command reports, and witness statements were routed to their destinations before the hour ended. No loose ends left to rumor. The digital billboard at Terminal B would rotate through 100 ads by noon, but the people who had stood there would remember what it accidentally announced. Joe turned toward the mat. The tomb waited in white certainty under a clearing sky. Rows of headstones stepped down the hills in perfect alignment. Flags shifted in the high breeze. Visitors at the plaza edge straightened as he approached, conversation dissolving without instruction. He took his position, felt the weight settle back onto familiar lines of posture and breath, and began. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm over black mat and marble, each strike a quiet declaration that promises still held, that memory still had guardians, that earned honor could still overrule purchased authority when the test arrived. The daughter in the wheelchair watched him and copied the pause again, tiny shoulders set with determined care. The elderly Marine touched 2 fingers to his brim. The freckled student stood with phone still in his pocket. Across the plaza, morning light moved over stone and bronze and wool, and the sacred order of duty, sacrifice, and remembrance stood restored.